Thanks. Yeah, I'm Boris, and I'm going to talk about to you how you can extend Xcode 8. I'm a core team member of CocoaPods. I also work at a company called Contentful, which is a content management solution for web and mobile apps. And we serve content to millions of users. So if you have any kind of editorial content in your apps, you might want to check it out. And I also have this nice coloring books with me. So if you find me in the break, you can get one, maybe. All right. So once upon a time, like 1 month ago, we had Xcode plugins. And they kind of, for example, looked like this. This was one I wrote, which could hide the debugger. And now, though, with Xcode 8, it is put under system integrity protection, which means it does not load any third-party code bundles anymore, which are unsigned. And also, simply code signing them with your own certificates also doesn't work. You get something like this, so it needs really to be something signed by Apple to be loaded. Or while testing, you can load other plugins signed by you, but not really in production. So instead, we got these Xcode source editor extensions, which is quite a mouthful, but they actually have a really tiny API. Basically, we can add menu items to the editor menu. And each of those items corresponds to one XC source editor command, which we'll see later what that actually is. And the command gets the current file, so the contents of the current file, and information about the selection as input, nothing else. It doesn't know about the project or anything else. And the commands are only available if a source file is currently open. So if you have a different kind of file open or no file, the command's actually not available. And in addition to this, the extension is a separate process using XPC, but it can invoke the host app. So you will need a host app for the extension, which is a normal OS X app. And you can invoke functionality in there, but you cannot do anything with Xcode, really. This is an example of a source editor extension. And yeah, as we see, basically it's one function that these commands have, which is perform. And it gets the XC source editor command invocation, which has all the information that I just mentioned, and then has a completion handler, where you can, which you call when the work is done, and optionally pass an error, which is then shown inside Xcode. And yeah, in the easiest case, we can get the buffer from the invocation. We can look at, for example, at the first selection, and each selection then tells you where it starts, where it ends, how many lines it has, stuff like this. So this basically takes the cursor position and insert a comment there. That's it. So that's the kind of stuff you can do. Basically, change a little bit of the current file that is open in the editor. To support this, there's a new framework called XcodeKit. And we're going to look a little bit at what's in there. So we have the XE source editor command invocation. That's the object we just saw. It has a buffer. It has a cancellation handler, which we can call when the so if the extension takes a bit longer, so we saw the completion handler. If the extension takes a bit longer, there will be like a HUD inside, or like more like a little notice inside the Xcode editor that the extension takes a little bit longer. and it will have a cancel button. And for that, the cancellation handler basically comes into play. It is asynchronous, so people can still edit things in the editor, but since the extension doesn't get updated information, it's probably a good idea if the extension takes long to actually cancel it for the user. And it gets a command identifier. This is basically to do more than, so each menu item has a command identifier. And if you want to handle multiple menu items in one XC source editor command class, or subclass rather, you can basically check the command identifier and do different things depending on it. Okay, this is what the XC source text buffer actually has in terms of properties. We have the complete buffer, which is the full contents of the current file. We have the content UTI, which you can use to identify if it's Objective-C, Swift, C. We have some information about the indentation. So if the user is using tabs, what's the tab width, what's the indentation width if they're not using tabs. So you can use this if you produce multiple lines of code. You can basically match the indentation style the user uses. Then we have the lines as a separate array, and we have the selections. And basically the idea is if you just want to append lines, for example, you don't change the complete buffer, but just append a line to the array, for example, because that's a little bit faster to do. We have the XC source text range. This is part of the selections, basically. So each selection is an XC source text range, which has a start and an end. We have the command that we just saw. That's a protocol where we can implement this perform function. There's the XC source editor extension, which is also a protocol. This is basically like an entry point for the extension, where we have the ability to do some work when the extension finishes launching. And we can also tell Xcode which commands are actually available via this array of arrays. We will say later what's actually in there. But basically, there are two ways to define the commands. One way is to do it in the info.plist of the extension, so statically. The other way is to do the command definitions in code, where you can be a little bit more dynamic on whatever. We will see that also as an example, what you can do there. Yeah, this is the keys we have in the command definition. There's a class name, which is the class that implements the XC source editor command protocol for that will be invoked for this command definition. We give it an identifier. That's the identifier we get in the perform function. And we give it a name. That's the string that is visible in the Xcode menu. We have an XC source text position. This is basically to see the insertion point of the user, so we know which line and which column they're in. And that's it. So the API is not really big. It all basically deals with defining menu items, or dealing with the user selection, or dealing with the code of the current file. That's all we have. Yeah, the distribution will work via the Mac App Store, or also we can use the developer signing, but there's no way to load unsigned extensions. Another thing that Xcode 8 brings is a little bit extended AppleScript dictionary. So that's another way we can kind of work with Xcode. And we can take a quick look at that. Just going to run this great tool, which is the AppleScript editor. And if you've never used it, this has the function open dictionary. And there we can open Xcode. And we can look at what functionality it provides. It's probably way too small. So let's terrible. Let me do something like this. Okay, this actually doesn't affect us at all. Great. Okay, we have to deal with this. So a bunch of stuff is there since a lot of Xcode versions, which is basically finding out a little bit about the current document that is open in Xcode, which scheme is selected, which destination is selected, things like that. And this actually comes in handy if we want to make our extension aware of the current project, for example. Because we can use the AppleScript functionality to query Xcode and find out which project is actually open. Because we can run AppleScript in the context of the app. And this allows us to get a little bit more information about the project that we don't get from the editor extension itself. What's new in Xcode 8 is basically that we also have the ability to trigger builds and things like this via AppleScript. So we can trigger a build, we can run, and we can test, things like that, and get the results of this back. I'm not really sure if that makes sense to integrate with the extensions, but it's functionality that's there now. Yeah, that's basically the AppleScript support. We will see a little example of how to invoke it. I think on the next slide, yes. So we can actually directly invoke AppleScript from Swift or Objective-C using this NS AppleScript object. We pass it a script as a string, and then we can execute it. This is basically the way to do it. And for example, this is an AppleScript with which we can get the path to the current workspace that is active inside Xcode. Yeah, as you can see, AppleScript looks really weird, but you can figure it out if you figure out other programming languages. So this will basically ask Xcode what is the active workspace document. You can then get the file of it, and from that you can get the path. And then it returns the path. And this will be a string that the run AppleScript function then returns if we pass it that script. Okay, so let's take a...
Don't mind me, but you're taking your microphone off.
Oh,
and
that's great.
No one in the room can hear you.
That's perfect. I didn't notice. Yeah, let's take a quick look at some existing extensions people have built. And I'm going to actually sit down for that, because it's really awkward to do otherwise. So let's go here. And let's make this a little bit bigger. So these are a few extensions people already created. A really interesting one I found is called Xcode Way, because that actually uses... oh, great. Fantastic Xcode. But it is open. Oh, well. All right. Let's also select a better thing for this. All right. So the interesting thing about this, so here we can see how we actually run those extensions. Funny story, by the way, I have the second Xcode entry here, which took me 2 hours the other day to figure out that's pointing to some Xcode I have since uninstalled. And if I run with this, I get this nice error. And at that point, the other entry was not there. It was like down here. So I basically tried for 2 hours updating Xcode, reinstalling Xcode, stuff like this. And in the end, it turns out you just need to select the right Xcode. And you get this nice grayish Xcode icon to show you, OK, this is the Xcode that's actually running in a debugger now. And as I said, to see the extensions, we need to have a source file open, and then we have a submenu for each extension. And this extension uses the ability to actually run code in the context of the host app. So if you click the About thing, for example, we see that actually the host app starts, and the About dialog pops up there. So you can actually, if you have some functionality in your host app, you can trigger that from the extension, and the host app will be launched if it's not running yet. And the way to do this is really easy. You basically just wait a second, it's in the command, I think, yeah. You basically just run code on the main queue, and anything that you run on the main queue will be executed in context of the app. Whereas if you just run code in the extension, normally it will be executed in the context of the extension. And in there, you will not have the ability, for example, to do stuff with Cocoa, because that will actually fail, because it won't have a main thread set up to do Cocoa things. I mean, AppKit things, of course, not Cocoa. So what this extension also does is you can navigate to certain folders, for example, derived data, which actually doesn't work in here because the extension doesn't have the right permissions. But we can change that. And the way to do this is to quit this. Let's open another project of mine, which is this one, which is another extension. We're just going to copy something from here. So as I said, the extension is sandboxed, and by default, a sandboxed process cannot access basically anything on the file system. We can use the temporary entitlement for files, though, to read-only access more files. And we're just going to put this into the plist of this extension. I mean, of course, in the entitlements of the extension. And then we can say this clean, and then we can run again. And now hopefully this should actually work. Yeah, probably if you use the temporary entitlements, this will not be something you can ship to the Mac App Store. But as I said, there will also be the ability to ship extensions with developer signing. So for those, it should be possible to use these temporary entitlements to give this more features. Oh yeah, if we have a non-source code file open like this, we actually don't have the menu for the extension. So we have to switch to a Swift file. And then this should actually work, and it does. Yes. So that's one main drawback, I think, of the App Store distribution of the extensions. It will be really annoying to actually set them up the first time for the user. So you can do another thing in the entitlements, which is you can request user-selected file permissions. That means you can pop up the file selection dialog, and when the user selects a folder or a file in there, the app will have the ability to read or write that file, depending on the permissions you give here. But that means they have to give you those permissions once and actually navigate there manually. So in theory, what we could also do is to have the app the first time when it realizes it doesn't have access, for example, to derived data, to ask the user, please go to derived data and give me permission to it. But that doesn't seem very practical. So I think the sandboxing can actually be a big issue with the stuff we can do in extensions. Okay, this took way longer than I thought, so we're gonna look at maybe one other extension, which is one I made called Clang formatter. And what this does, oh yeah, this doesn't work, as we know. What this does is it basically ships the Clang format command line tool as part of the extension and runs it for the current file, basically. So in the perform function, I'm creating a task. I give it this parameter. At the moment, it's very simple. So there's just one style. You can't select the style for the Clang format. And it's going to get passed the complete buffer as data, passed in via standard in. And then we launch the Clang format process. And get back the formatted output on std out and put it back into the invocation. So basically, my first implementation was this, just putting the output string in the complete buffer. This is actually something that crashes Xcode. So instead, I'm now doing this, which is removing all lines and then adding lines individually, which actually works. And we can also take a look at that. So the bad thing about Clang formatter is it really only supports Objective-C, so we need an Objective-C file to do this. Let's just take a random one. And we can, again, go into the editor menu. OK, this is another funny thing about the extensions. Sometimes they don't really start up in the debug Xcode. So the only thing we can do when that happens is we do it again. It happens a lot less in beta 3. In beta 1, that was basically every second time you invoked them. Now it's like every 10th time, so it's getting better. All right, so now we can Clang format this, and now it has formatted the file according to some style. Yeah, I want to make this a little bit better eventually so that you can pass in your own styles and stuff like this, similar to the existing Clang format plugin for Xcode, where you can do all that, and also maybe format a selection. But this is an example of a plugin. So there was this Clang format third-party plugin people wrote, and this is actually fully possible to do again with the source editor extensions. So some of the existing plugins can actually be ported to this. The Xcode Way plugin we saw earlier is a similar one, where there was version for previous versions of Xcode as a plugin, and now it's done as an extension. So even though the API is very limited, at least some of the plugins that we maybe used in the past can be ported over and still exist. Okay. There's not much more on the slides. It's actually really easy to find extensions on GitHub. We can just search for XC source editor command in source code. And basically all the things that pop up are Xcode editor extensions. And there's actually a bunch. When I did this search a few days ago, it was like 50 already. Not all of them were really useful, but some of them were. There was, for example, also one for doing searches on the current selection. So, for example, you could highlight something and search on Stack Overflow for it. So there's a bunch of useful stuff already. Thanks. There's some resources on the slides you might want to check out, and this is how you can find me. And maybe we're doing questions?
Yep. So I'm going to try and run the microphone, but I don't, Boris, if you want to repeat the question if I don't get there fast enough.
Okay.
Okay.
You mentioned you could trigger builds with extensions to AppleScript. Could you also listen for, let's say they use the triggers a unit test, could you listen for the output with your extension?
Not really. What you can do is you could figure out the derived data path for the current project and then just monitor the file system for new build logs or something like this. That would be a possibility, but as far as I know, there's no way to listen for builds.
I'm still not clear what you can actually do with these extensions. Can you give a couple of use cases, what you can actually write with them?
Yeah, as I said, the main use case is doing something with the current file or the current selection of the user. So you can move the selection, you can insert stuff into the current file, you can take the source code and process it, so you can format it, for example. You could insert something. Stuff like this. This is the main use case. What you can also do is, because basically it triggers just a function, you can try to also do other things. You cannot really affect Xcode in any way, but you can affect the rest of the system, right? Like the extension that opens the Finder at a certain location. You could also, if you have so you also always have a Mac app where the extension is hosted. So if that app displays something, for example, it could run another command on the current project or something. You could trigger that from Xcode. You can't really talk back to Xcode other than affecting the current file.
Okay. Thank you for the great talk. Just wondering if it is possible in Xcode extension that you can use another runner. Say, for example, most of the users wanted to lint their source code using SwiftLint or something like that. So is it possible to use that runner as a part of our extension or maybe the plugin, so that quickly user can select edit and run SwiftLint, so that
that would be totally possible, yeah. Similar to the it's basically the same thing that Clang format does, right? The problem is, how do you display the results? Basically, what you would need to do is to put them as comments maybe in the current file, because there's no way to display anything inside Xcode. The only way we can communicate back to the user is basically the file. The other way would be to say, okay, we display the results in the app. So the app has some kind of view where it shows the SwiftLint results. there you would have the problem. Okay, will you get back to Xcode from there? So yes, in theory you could do it, but probably not in a nice way.
Cool. Thank you so much.
While we're here.
Great talk, really interesting. Thank you. Couple of quick questions. One is, am I right, you've got absolutely no access to any of the project information, so you don't know what your deployment target is or anything?
A way you can do this is, as I said, with AppleScript.
Yeah.
One issue of AppleScript is it only works on the main thread, so you would always need to launch the app, basically, to run AppleScript. But via AppleScript, you could query the currently open project and figure out things like the deployment target or stuff like this.
Okay, so to kind of loop back into the same in the current project, run that via AppleScript. Yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah, you could do that. Like I said, the main issue is you would need to run it in the context of the app, which means that probably takes a little bit, like not too long, but probably long enough that the user already sees the little information window. The plugin is taking the extension is taking too long, because that actually comes up really fast.
I guess you could do it once, cache it, and then hope that they're not changing it every 5 minutes.
Yeah,
something like
that. You could do something like this. What you cannot do without getting additional permissions is actually look at the project, right? You can get the path of the project, but if you wanted to, say, I don't know, list the contents of that directory, that would actually by default not be possible because the extension is sandbox, right?
Yeah, you can see what they're trying to get to, the kind of security that they're getting a bit paranoid and they're worried about people mucking around code.
Yeah, I mean, one option is, I'm not sure which permissions will actually be allowed for the source code extensions, but I'm guessing at least the user selected file permission will be possible. So what you could do is to ask, like, if it's an unknown or like project you don't have access to, you could ask the user the first time to give you access to that project, maybe by dragging it onto your app or something like this.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And the other quick questions, you know if it will work with interface builder or if it's only Swift files?
As far as I know, it's only source code. So it can be Objective-C, it can be Swift, I think it can also be C and stuff like this, but it has to be source code. It will not be available, I think, for interface builder. We can actually quickly check that, to be honest. It's probably the easiest way.
That's my last question. I pass the mic back.
So I just need to find something that has an interface builder file. Oh yeah, the extension itself has one. If we just run this. And open this. This should have like a storyboard, I think. Nope, it's not there. So I think it's correct that it's only there for source code at the moment, which makes sense because they're also called source code extensions, editor extensions.
Hi, thank you for the talk as well. And for the code signing plugin that worked with before Xcode 8, because I used that and it's great. My question was around selection lines. So you had an example earlier. Do you know if they're trimmed at the end, or do they come exactly as what the selection is? Say you wanted to select multiple lines, split them. What would be in the selections array? I'm
not sure, but I think they're not trimmed.
Makes sense. It's just what it is. Do you have any ideas how you might, this is niche, unit test like some of the code? Because you mentioned that the process will run a debug version of Xcode or like a sandbox version. Do you have any ideas about how we might verify the work that we've got when writing a plugin? Is it just factoring the code out and unit testing that?
I think so. Basically, you could just create the same invocation object in your tests and create, instantiate the command, give it a mocked version of the context, and then see what comes back. Because that's the only way it communicates with Xcode anyway. It's basically just this one object or this one little object graph, and it should be fairly straightforward to unit test that.
Cool,
so
thank you.
Not so much in there.
Okay. Okay, one more question from the back, and then we'll wrap.
All right, a quick twofold question. First of all, thank you for the talk, really interesting. I have a question from the point of view of a daily Xcode user. First of all, will we find a new section in the Mac App Store for all these extensions, if that's the distribution model? And second of all, does that mean that all the extensions will need to be running as apps while Xcode is open?
First question, I don't really know. I think there's a developer tools section. I'm assuming it will be somewhere under that, but maybe there's then something that shows you that it comes with an extension. I'm not sure. I don't think there's any information yet how this will actually look like. As far as the second question goes, which I already forgot, can you?
If these extensions will be standalone apps installed from the app stores, if they have to be running.
They need to be an app, but unless you actually trigger something in the app will not run. It's just the extension that's running, and you will not see the app icon in the dock. But once you trigger something in the app, basically by executing something on the main thread or the main queue of the app, or dispatch something to the main queue from the extension, then the app will start up and will also be visible in the dock.
Okay. Round of applause, Boris. Thank you.